All right. Thank you very much, Brittany. Appreciate the intro there. And I also appreciate the bribery to get more people to show up to this. So that's all good. Excuse me. Welcome to this webinar. I am talking about Microsoft Ignite. I was there a couple weeks ago. We're going to look at the product and certification changes that matter. And I will tell you that I do not expect this to run an hour because really what I saw at Ignite from both a product standpoint and also really from a certification standpoint is more evolutionary rather than revolutionary. All right, just a quick couple things. All right, hi, I am Tracy Wallace. That's a bigger picture of me. And I am a Microsoft certified trainer, have been for, I think I figured it out, 24 years. And if you want to get in touch with me, there's my all my contact approaches there. And that Twitter in particular, I have a shamefully, woefully low number of Twitter followers. And I am starting to put out updates as far as our INE content. So feel free to follow me on Twitter, and I will follow you back. All right, enough about me. What we're going to talk about are the Ignite 2019 announcements that I feel are important, and a little bit of overview there, and also some Microsoft certification updates. All right, let's jump right in here and get into our 2019 announcements. Now, when we're looking at our 2019 announcements, what really is kind of critical here, sorry about that, is that it really starts with the cloud. And in particular, we are looking at Azure and Office 365, now referred to as Microsoft 365. And I will say one of the big things I saw, and I'm really not sure how much this is really going to play out in the market, is that Microsoft is definitely pushing for Dynamics 365, which is, kind of, it's not CRM, it's more than that, but that's kind of the easiest way, if you're not familiar with it, to understand what it is and what it does. All right, so, those really, as far as big picture and what mattered and what seemed most important to Microsoft, there are those three elements. Now, a couple things to know about this. Officially, there were 172 specific announcements made at Ignite relative to new products, although most of those really weren't new products. They were really, as I said, more evolutionary for existing products. And we'll talk a bit more about that with some specifics as we go through. Now, center, we have the cloud, right? There is an on-premises story coming out of Ignite 2019, but the reality is the primary story for on-premises coming out of 2019 is to think hybrid. Because what was really funny to me is they would talk about the cloud, and whether it's in a session or whether it's in the keynote, there's this discussion of the cloud. And then there's this kind of minor discussion, oh yeah, we have some on-prem stuff too. And guess what the on-prem stuff really does? It's really about how it integrates with the cloud. Not that it doesn't work on premises. And I was actually talking to some people, for example, that were Windows Server 2019, were real excited about that, and talked about some of the things like migrations that were there. But really for Microsoft, even with the on-prem, what you really saw were the different ways that you can integrate the on-prem with the cloud. And so, we're going to talk about that, and we're actually going to look at that just a little bit. Also, other on-prem technologies that are really tied into the cloud is that there was a lot of Azure Stack. And, honestly, when I first started seeing Azure Stack, I was like, wow, that's a pretty cool concept, but it's just going to be really difficult for a lot of people to implement. They really iterated on that, and not only is it, I think, a more viable on-premises solution, but they have things like hyper-converged infrastructure where they've got partners who are building this into their systems, highly available systems. There's different offerings from Microsoft as well, so I think that's going to be more a more rational or really practical solution for a lot of places. I think the biggest thing, the announcement that got the most buzz, and frankly that I'm the most interested in myself, is something called Azure Arc. And that really if you talk about what was really new and introduced in Ignite, I think that was the biggest introduction. We'll talk a bit more about that in just a moment. Now, there were some other things that I would almost say were underlying themes, and one is Kubernetes. And Kubernetes is really kind of going everywhere within really the entire Microsoft framework, and looking at ways that Kubernetes can be implemented and improvements to its implementation in the cloud in Azure, but also different ways to implement it, be it through Azure Arc or in support of Azure Arc on premises as well, and through Azure Stack. And really, it just kind of permeates everywhere within the Microsoft environment. So if there's a technology out there that you're not familiar with, that I'd recommend that you should think about, at least put on your radar, it would definitely be the Azure Stack, excuse me, not the Azure Stack, the Kubernetes clustering and container management and system. All right, so there we've got that. Now another, just something that just has gotten a lot of love, and I saw this really in three ways, from just a Microsoft perspective in terms of what's being presented, what's new, but also a little bit of certification. We'll talk about that, but also just talking to people, going out and just having those one-on-one conversations, that there is a lot of excitement about Teams. Now, Teams is not a new product, and there's not anything really even that I would say was a monumental announcement regarding Teams, but just lots of little integrations into Teams. And you can just see how Teams is really becoming one of those absolute kind of first tier products for Microsoft, and it's being integrated in really just about everything. So that's the big picture. Right now, what I want to do is break it down just a little bit, and unfortunately, there'll be a little bit of death by PowerPoint here because I've got some bullet point slides, but I'm really going to just go through these concepts relatively quickly and talk about what, you know, some of the highlights were coming out of the conference. And so what are some of the big picture things? As I said, number one big picture thing is absolutely Azure Arc. This gets circled. Definitely take a look at this. What this is, if you're not familiar with it, is an extension of Azure into the on-premises environment. So not only can I go and manage resources on premises through Azure, but I can provision things like an Azure SQL database on premises. And that is something that, again, has lots of buzz. In fact, the next webinar that I do is going to be on Azure Arc in December, and I'll remind you of that at the end of this. But tremendous capability, something you might want to look into. As I mentioned just a moment ago, Azure Stack has really clearly something that Microsoft sees as a growing component of really their product line. And there are a number of Azure Stack products that were either revealed or kind of announced, even though they may have already existed. Azure Stack Hub, which used to just be Azure Stack, can run in connected or disconnected mode. They talked a lot, and I saw a lot of this on the vendor floor, is hyper-converged infrastructure, or HCI. And that's really where Microsoft is working with vendor partners to provide that end-to-end hybrid solution, where you've got high availability hardware running on premises that may or may not be connected up into the cloud, into Azure in this case. And as you can see, there's over 150 solutions. This was announced during the keynote, and there's over 20 vendors. And there was, for example, a solution from Lenovo that was extremely cost effective and had a 2-node solution running on premises and integrated. Microsoft also has some hardware solutions. There's the Azure Stack Edge commercial, which provides, it's a rack-mounted system. You just get it from Microsoft. It's no capital cost. You're basically renting it, and you put it in your rack, and it's got direct GPU capability. It also, and this is something that I have no idea what it is, but it sounded really cool, is a private cellular network. So if you're a networking person and that gets you Really excited, something to look into. They also had, and it was kind of fun, and it's an interesting concept, is Azure Stack ruggedized, and including down to a backpack version. So you could walk around with a backpack on that was running Azure on its own, which is pretty cool. So they're really shrinking down the requirements to run that Azure Stack. And the idea there would be for things like first responders, et cetera. Now, one of the things that was highlighted, and I have the asterisks there because this has been around actually for a couple of weeks at least, if not a couple of months in general availability, and that is Azure Bastion. And I'm going to show you that because if nothing else, it gets really boring just seeing a bunch of bullet points. I'll get to that in just a moment. There were also a lot of new VM series that were announced. One of the things I think is kind of interesting is they now have a couple of series that are specific to AMD. So if you want to use AMD processors instead of Intel processors, you now have that option. But that's also something that just is continually evolving. But Azure Bastion, I think, is really cool. And what it is, I'm going to just draw this out here really quickly. Let's say that you're in Azure and you've got your virtual network. And in that virtual network, you've got a couple of virtual machines in a subnet. Now, I realize they're not actually in the subnet because you've got, of course, network interface cards. Now, if I'm out here on the internet, and this is me, I'm happy because it's Tuesday and I'm wearing a hat. And if I wanted to connect to these virtual machines, then what I would have to do is I would have to have a public IP address, and I would have to have, you know, some ports that were allowed, for example, 3389, assuming that's a Windows machine. And that's always been problematic for me. Yes, you have things like just in time that they added in, but at the end of the day, you still have that public endpoint, and that's really been problematic for a lot of people. So what they've done now is gotten rid of that. Well, you can still have that, but as an alternative, we now have Azure Bastion. And Bastion is a service that sits in its own subnet. And what you do is you connect to Bastion over HTTPS, and then Bastion is going to give you access over either RDP or SSH directly into a machine that's in that virtual network. And then, of course, you can bounce around from there. What I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and show you this really quickly. So let's go ahead and pop over there. If I can find it. There we go. All right. I already have this installed, and I wanted to show you, I've got Bash, and I was going to show you, but it's really not very exciting. I do want to show you the virtual network and the diagram for the virtual network that I've got set up. Okay. And I've got a virtual network. There are 2 subnets, and I've got 3 virtual machines. Notice, if you're familiar with these diagrams or take my word for it, none of these virtual machines have a public IP address. So they're not directly publicly available. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my Windows 2019 machine, and I'm going to click Connect. And I'm going to pop over here to Bastion, and I'm going to put in my username. And password, and I'm going to connect up. And coming up, you can see I'm now logging in to this Windows machine. It's setting it up, and we'll let that percolate for a moment. Let's go back here, and let's do the same thing to connect up to an Ubuntu server. Go to connect to the Ubuntu server, go to Bastion, and connect up. and it's going to open up an SSH session over HTTPS, fully managed. I don't have to have any drivers on my machine, and I can, for example, PS, may not be able to see this, but at least you should see movement, and that's just making sure that the Azure agent is running on this machine, and it turns out it is, right? And I can go and interact with my Windows machine, right? So I'm connecting to both of these without opening up ports directly to the virtual machines, without even having a public IP address. And for me, that was, next to Azure Arc, one of the more important things, I think, to come out of Ignite. All right, let's go ahead and carry on from here. Again, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to put those questions into the Q&A, and I'll definitely get to them, if nothing else, by the end of this webinar. Now, as far as Azure Data and AI, all right, there were a couple of things. Again, most of this was definitely evolutionary, and so I kind of picked and chose, so we have a few things on the slide here, what I thought were the most interesting. I'm not going to demo any of these, because if I would demo, it would probably be Azure Synapse or the database for PostgreSQL. And in either case, that would be really pretty expensive to actually demonstrate correctly. So I'm not going to do that for a webinar. But in any case, new product you may hear about, Azure Synapse. If you're in big data, what they've done is they've taken the Azure Data Warehouse and they've merged it with Data Lake. And so now you've got massive scale, structured and direct unstructured access to data, or I should say direct access to structured and unstructured data through Azure Synapse. There's also, this is actually pretty cool, Azure Database for PostgreSQL Hyperscale. And the idea being that whereas we've always had certain limitations on database size in Azure, you now have effectively unlimited not only storage size, but also process size. It will scale a single database across multiple nodes for both storage and processing. That is currently available for the PostgreSQL database in Azure. That was pretty cool, because I think that's always been something of a limitation as far as cloud-based databases in Azure, is how much storage can we easily have, how much processing can we easily associate with the database. They've also upped some of the limits, some of the process and memory limits on the Azure SQL database. That took a lot to say. On the AI side, again, this is something that continues to move forward. One of the things I don't have listed here is that they continue to work towards making AI easier for non-data scientists to interact with. There's actually now a route where you can go and completely run AI modeling without actually having to set it up yourself. Obviously, of course, you would then have to tune it and be interactive, but that is there. I think two of the really cool things that I saw were synthetic speech, which is also a little bit scary. You can now train their speech cognitive services for what's called custom neural voice. And you will train it like you would train pretty much any system, but you would train it with your own voice. And then it can start to talk in your voice, right? So it's not just recording your voice. You could actually give it text and would speak it in your voice, as opposed to the kind of standard computer generated voice. Cool stuff, a little bit scary. Also, personal information, personally identifiable information, or PII extraction, has now been added to text analytics. And so again, those are kind of little things that are there. I don't think they're necessarily massive scope in terms of who's going to be using that, but it does give you an idea that they are continuously progressing in the AI field. If I had lots of time and didn't need to actually make a living, 100%, that's what I would go do, because that stuff is just fascinating. And you know, when the machines take over, I would like them to know me as their friend, would be the other reason I would go into AI. All right, another thing, I mentioned this before, there is so much Kubernetes. Kubernetes, if you're not familiar with it, it is it's usually referred to as an orchestration platform. Sometimes you'll hear it as a clustering platform for your container, I almost said Docker container, but for your containerized solutions, if you're not sure what containers are, that is definitely something you want to go and take a look at. But Kubernetes is something that has really just taken over as the de facto standard for running workloads on the back end, really, and certainly in Azure. And one of the things they've done in Azure is they've made it a lot easier to work with Kubernetes. One of the things they've done is they've really upped the hybrid game. I can, first of all, if I'm going to use Azure Arc, I'm going to be using Kubernetes with that. It's available on Azure Stack Hub as well, making it very easy to deploy. And there are many features that have been added. And again, none of these are what I would call a new product, but definitely new features. You can now tie in advanced threat protection with your Kubernetes cluster, with your solutions, with your containerized solutions running on Kubernetes. It has much better availability. You've got availability zones. It also has auto scale capabilities now, which I'm going to show you. And you also have multiple node groups, not just multiple nodes, but multiple node groups. And you've got better security, better logging, better security, of course, integrated with advanced threat protection. It now has an open monitoring protocol. It, for example, supports Prometheus, if you're familiar with that. And as a developer, it's got some pretty cool additions as far as dev spaces, how you can use Kubernetes to really collaborate or collaboratively develop and run and easily run and test your containerized solutions. All right, what I'm going to do now is just show you really quickly, just to get off of this death by PowerPoint here. I'm going to pop back over and the wrong one. There we go. I'm going to go to my dashboard, and I actually have already deployed Kubernetes. And what I'm going to do is go to my node pools. And this is where now in general availability, you can have multiple node pools. So if I've got different workloads that require different underlying processing capabilities, I can do that. I can also go over here to a node pool and I can go and scale it. And it's pretty simple. The scaling, I can go manual or I can auto scale. Also, not controlled through here, but as a containerized solution you can add to Kubernetes. There's also a pod scaler, which looks at your pod operations and see if you need to automatically deploy new pods for a given solution. Again, that's all terminology specific to Kubernetes. Nodes are the underlying VMs that are running your Kubernetes cluster, and pods are really sets of containers that get deployed. Right? But anyways, you can see that I could go from 2 to 100, but maybe I would only want to go from 2 to 4, and I currently have 2 nodes. So there we go, that's it. It's now setting up auto scale. I don't have anything running on it, so hopefully it will not rack up too much of a bill before I am done with this webinar. All right, so that's just a quick thing. Again, that's just so simple. I've got auto scale. That was always an issue that I had with Kubernetes, with earlier iterations of Kubernetes, Azure Kubernetes Cluster, Azure Kubernetes Service, and before that, Azure Container Services, was that there really wasn't a great auto scale capability. Now you can run your nodes, your process nodes, on a virtual machine scale set. And that's actually an option you select when you're provisioning the Kubernetes service. And that's why you have that auto scale capability. All right. Microsoft Office 365, out of the 172 announcements made at Ignite, 55 of those announcements were related to Office or Microsoft 365. Some of the things, there's, again, not too much here that was what I would call revolutionary, but definitely some pretty cool things. Project Cortex is something to look at, and really semantic search ties into that as well. Microsoft is looking at really how can they help organizations find and manage and categorize the information that they store. This is something that has always been an issue. I've been, for example, training in SharePoint since SharePoint came out, well, okay, since 2002, and that's always been an issue in SharePoint. We have all of this knowledge. How do we manage it in a way that's effective for the users? Well, now what Project Cortex does is it's running artificial intelligence. It's looking at patterns of behavior. It's looking at documents. It's automatically categorizing not just documents, but any kind of information, with the idea being that when somebody is interacting with their Office 365 environment, they're getting information that is being pushed to them that is important to them. And again, interesting concept, powerful concept. I'm not sure how many organizations are going to run out and immediately integrate this into what they're doing, but it's definitely something I think that is pretty cool. I don't know how many people use Streams, but it was a really cool demonstration. They're kind of plugging artificial intelligence into that. That's their streaming service. And what they did was showed an example of eliminating background noise there was a person outside and they were doing a report, and it just took away everything but their voice, which was pretty cool. Again, Teams is something not so much that there were a lot of announcements, but just how ubiquitous Teams was. There are some things in terms of improvements to callings and rooms and meetings, and they've added this concept of virtual consultations, which is an idea of, exactly as the name sounds, you've got some kind of consultative environment. The obvious example would be some kind of medical environment where maybe I'm out at a remote clinic environment and I need to consult with a doctor, and they've got things set up to optimize that. Also, long live OneNote, right? And I will tell you, I didn't even know to be afraid of this until I was at Ignite and they announced that they weren't going to stop support for OneNote, and that OneNote, I guess 2016, is going to have support through 2025. And that was just something that was both a relief to me, but I can't really say that because I didn't even know that was the case. But a lot of people love OneNote. Obviously, it's still going to be part of the Office 365 package. So if you are a OneNote fan and you were not aware that it was going away, well, you're still right. If you're a OneNote fan and you were afraid it's going away, it's not going away just yet. Developer tools. One of the things I think that's really interesting with the way Microsoft is headed is they're really putting a push for low-code and no-code solutions. And there's some solutions that are out there now, particularly the Power Platform, that got a lot of attention at Ignite. I'm not sure that the way that they are pushing it, certainly for certification, is exactly right, but it is a powerful concept. And I actually sat in on a technology keynote, and this was with a gentleman, Scott Hanselman. If you ever get a chance to see anything he does, it's amazing. And he was really talking about it, and he, I'm not sure his position, but it's important in the Microsoft dev environment. And he was kind of talking about this, that Microsoft really is looking to support all developers, and from your very low-level hardcore developers to your kind of what I would consider myself kind of a commodity developer using C#, to people that aren't typically developers. And two of the things that came out with that I thought were really interesting are Power Automate. And they've had this, it's a rebranding of Flow, but they've really extended the number of connectors that work with it. There's actually a robotics component now. So conceptually, you can actually integrate and automate manufacturing floor activities into an overall process flow. So it's a pretty powerful concept. And the Power Virtual Agent, this is one that, again, really represents where Microsoft has been headed for several years. And the idea is to create intelligent bots that you have as a complete no-code solution. All right, Fluid Framework, that is designed not so much as a no-code, but a lower-code solution to build what are called fluid applications. And I mentioned earlier, in terms of artificial intelligence, the AI Builder is a no-code solution for taking massive amounts, petabytes of data, and being able to create artificial intelligence, machine learning modeling around that without having to be a data scientist. And again, that's one of those things where if you are a data scientist, you're probably saying put the brakes on, because you need someone that knows what they're doing to really push that. That's absolutely true. I am not a data scientist. I would not want to take the solutions that I created in an AI builder and directly go up to a CEO of a major company and say, here, you need to change the way you work. However, it would give me the ability to start to build models to then have a starting point where maybe I bring in a data scientist, or if I'm making decisions or helping make decisions that aren't at that level of, a CEO of a Fortune 100 company, then, is it something that I don't really necessarily need a data scientist for? And that's really what they're looking at. Visual Studio Online is actually, finally, Visual Studio Online. This is something that I think Microsoft's been talking about for a while. In fact, they even branded their DevOps product, which is now Azure DevOps. For a long time, that was Visual Studio Online. But for me, if I'm going to run Visual Studio Online, I actually want to run Visual Studio Online. And we now have that. And I'm going to show you that in just a moment. For any developers, the newest version of WinUI, kind of your universal Windows development platform, is out in alpha. And if that's something as a developer you're excited about, that's cool. But I do want to show you Visual Studio Online. While I don't necessarily think that this was the biggest announcement, it was definitely the one that I was happiest about. And what I have right now is, what you're looking at is Visual Studio Code, VS Code. Okay? Now, I can run VS Code on any platform. I can run it on my desktop. However, what we have here is a virtual machine that's running this. And the way I set that up, I'm in Explorer right now. I can go back. Oh, I kind of closed it. But you can open up, you can create what are called workspaces. And then I can do things, for example, like, and again, this is probably a little bit small, sorry about that. But if you're a .NET developer, I'm just typing out .NET new console. And it's creating a console. And then if I were to go .NET run, it's going to run that. And the cool thing about this is, there we go, I got the hello world. I can go in, this is my environment. I can add various extensions into the Visual Studio Code environment. I can run this, it will automatically integrate with my on-prem environment. There's a ton of things that you can do with this environment. So if you are a developer, I would definitely take a look at this. It's pretty low cost. Right now, it's in preview. So you've got preview pricing, and the way it prices out is a little bit strange, but it's still kind of interesting. All right, on-premises. What do we have for on-premises? So Windows 2019, which I actually thought had already been released formally, is officially released in production. The biggest thing by far that was discussed, and pretty much every time I saw Windows 2019 discussed, this is what was discussed, and that is the Windows Admin Center. This is a improved version 19.10. So Windows Admin Center is a web-based environment for managing your SQL Server. It's really designed to replace Server Manager. But one of the things that it can do is it can integrate, not surprisingly, with Azure. So I can actually manage, for example, virtual machines in Azure through my Windows Admin Center. And I'm gonna just give you a brief look at Windows Admin Center. And virtual desktop on Azure Stack Hub. So if you're running the Windows VDI, you can now run that on top of Azure Stack Hub. Also, there's an improved Windows subsystem for Linux, Windows subsystem for Linux 2, which technically is a Windows 10 feature. But as I said, I kind of felt bad for Windows Server, and I needed to put a little something else in there for it. For SQL Server 2019 was officially announced. I actually think that had been released before. And what I do think is kind of interesting, notice the top two things that are announced about SQL Server are advanced data security for SQL on Azure VMs and Azure SQL Database Edge, where you can actually provision Azure SQL databases in your own environment. There were some other things, big data clusters, which are going to combine Spark and HDFS, so Hadoop file system, into SQL Server. allowing you to do big data analysis in clusters on-prem. Data virtualization, which is allowing you to write queries across multiple data sources, both on-prem and in the cloud, without having to download that data. It's going to pull that data in real time. And then the secure enclave is actually kind of cool. I like this. I'm not sure how universally important this is going to be, but what it does is it actually extends the SQL Server always encrypted concept. And that's something when Microsoft added that, I was very excited because I think it's something that makes encryption actually meaningful, where you're encrypting data with a key that's stored externally to SQL Server. Well, what this does is it actually takes the decryption of your data and it moves it into an isolated, what's called enclave, in the actual processor itself. So not only is your data fully encrypted at rest, but even when it's being processed in the SQL Server itself, then nothing's going to be able to access it. And that's part of Microsoft's trusted compute, and it's very cool concepts in general. Again, I'm not sure how widespread the need for this is, but if you have very highly sensitive data, or for example, if you're mixing data from different vendors that can never see each other's data, that's where that kind of capability comes into play. Very good stuff. Now, in case you just want a one-stop shop for all of this, there's a link here. This link was provided by John Deerdorf at SQL MCT, is somebody I happen to know. And he just went through, it's not his document, he just provided the link, which, by the way, is no endorsement of this webinar from him. I don't think he'd be against it, but what you can do if you want to see all 172, and it was 172 because I counted it, announcements, they're all here in this nice little book form, and you've got a table of contents, and then you go into any of them that you're interested in, which is more detail than I thought prudent to take a look at here. All right, so those are the fun new things coming from Azure. And I'm going to take a moment. I see I've got one question coming out of this. Again, if you've got questions, please don't hesitate, because truth be told, the coverage of the changes to certification is really pretty small. So let's see here. Hello, this is Avinash Sema. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Here from Poland. Excellent. My question is, can we create all these servers in VMware also, or only we need to use Hyper-V? Are these Microsoft products? You can now use VMware. Now, I haven't done anything with it, but that was actually, it's a great question. The integration with VMware was one of the announcements that was made at Ignite, and I'm now wishing I had traveled down that path a little bit more to give you more information. But it is definitely, I believe Azure Arc also works with VMware. And there was something else that used to not work, and I apologize off the top of my head, I don't have it, but you will definitely see more integration with VMware and Azure. All right. Now, let's talk about changes to Microsoft certifications. Okay. Big picture. Not surprisingly, the focus is on the cloud. And also not surprisingly, there's much love for Teams. In fact, there's a new and I would say really the only product-specific learning path or role is for Teams. And we'll talk about in a moment what's new for Windows Server, SQL Server, Exchange, SharePoint, and development. I would, in general, expect more hands-on during exams. That's something that they have introduced. I've had that on, I had retaken the Azure Architect and Azure Admin. I passed them both the first time, but I wanted to see how they changed. And in both of those, there's actually live, real-time, hands-on labs that you have to complete successfully as part of the exam. And that's something that definitely seems that they are going towards. There's also a new training portal from Microsoft Learning. And if you want to go and check that out, you can just do a search on, I guess it's actually now Microsoft Learn. So that's a big picture overview. By the way, In terms of the focus on the cloud, all of the new roles, and if you are familiar with Microsoft certification, at the last Ignite, so in Ignite 2018, they introduced this whole new approach, which really isn't that new, but it's what they're excited about. This whole new approach to certification, which is role-based certification. The idea being that they're looking to move away from specific technologies and look more at the roles that people have and need to prove their competency on. And so that was introduced as a concept, really rolled out first for Azure, and then has rolled out pretty significantly for Office as well. And now what you'll see is that there were 8 new roles that were announced, and 1 for Azure, which I think is kind of very much a niche role. A couple of new interesting roles for Office 365, and they are absolutely pushing for Dynamics 365. It's kind of interesting because Dynamics is getting a lot of love both from Microsoft and from Microsoft Learning or Microsoft Learn, but I'm still not 100% convinced that it's going to see a massive certification requirement. Keep an eye out on it. Again, it is something that the vendor themselves are very interested in, but in my experience, sometimes that pans out to be important, sometimes not so much. Now, what about what's new for Windows Server, SQL Server Exchange, and SharePoint in development? Basically nothing. Okay? I'll hit that with some detail in just a moment, but that's pretty much the answer here, is they really haven't done very much with any of that. Now, as far as new role-based certifications, on the Azure side, as I mentioned, they added Azure for SAP workloads. That's interesting, but I think also it's something that is fairly niche, right? You're not going to have everybody going over there and dropping their SAP workloads into Azure. It's something that Microsoft worked with SAP to develop this certification. There is a need. That's why the certification exists. I think that's going to be a relatively small population that is going to pursue and need that. But if you need it, it's there. There is that certification where you can prove your capabilities. On the Microsoft 365, I mentioned that Teams is getting a lot of love. So we now have Microsoft 365 Teams Administrator, whereas most of the roles that they currently have, such as a teamwork administrator or messaging administrator, are technically role-based and not technology or product-based. This clearly is specific to a product. And I think they may have done that partially because the teamwork focuses a lot on SharePoint, and they just wanted to be able to add more teams in there without kind of reworking that entire role certification. There's also a Microsoft 365 developer, which I think is probably overdue. Now, on the Dynamics side, again, 5 new certifications that have been announced on Dynamics 365. Of those, to me, the first one is the most important. And I would personally like to see Microsoft really go farther down the Power Platform and have its own standalone certifications, because for me, I personally think that Power Apps certainly have a larger audience for Office 365 than they do for Dynamics 365. But if you want to go beyond the fundamentals, as you can see, I've got Power Apps and Dynamics Solution Architect and Power Apps and Dynamics Developer, right? So the Power Apps certifications are tied into Dynamics 365 right now. I don't see that changing, but maybe at some point it will. They also have a Finance and Operation Apps Developer and also a Finance and Operation Apps Solution Architect. Notice something about all 5 of the new Dynamics 365. They're all about developing solutions. So clearly there's a big push from Microsoft to get more solution developers active in Dynamics 365 so that, well, they can sell more Dynamics 365. Okay? But those are the new role-based certifications. Again, there was nothing in that blew me away. There was nothing that I think was as disruptive as last year's announcements for role-based authentication. Now, everything else, a lot of things here, but really what it comes down to is pretty much nothing else has changed. There are still MCSE programs. Now, I had expected that Windows 2019 and possibly SQL Server 2019 would get announcements in terms of certification. They did not. And in fact, without going into any details, I got the impression that they're not even close to certifications, that at some point they'll get around to updating the certs, but it's absolutely not a priority. So the certs are still there. In fact, you can still get a valid Windows Server 2012, 2012 R2 MCSE. And there's been no substantial changes to the 2016 MCSE or MCSE since in the entirety of 2019. The SQL Server MCSE is the only thing that's kind of new is, not surprisingly, Azure related, and that is you can get your MCSE with an exam on Cosmos DB. Now that's actually been around a while, so it's not really a new announcement. Now I will say that if you are pursuing SQL Server, and to an extent I think this applies to 2016 as well, Windows Server 2016, that the exams are somewhat version agnostic. And so in other words, I think if you we're headed towards your 2016, there wouldn't be a massive change to get into the 2019. And I would expect, again, this is just experience, no explicit knowledge, I expect there would probably be fairly straightforward upgrade paths when and if those come out. On the MCSD and MCSA, those have not had substantive changes since January of 2018. They were refreshed in January of 2018, but there's no explicit plans. There is, I believe, an update coming up sometime in 2020, but it did not appear that update was going to be anything massively substantive, probably just catching up a little bit to where the technology is. All right, and so that's the story. And again, I know I've spent, as I always do, longer than I expected, but the end of the day is what's coming out of Microsoft, out of Ignite, is that cloud and hybrid are pretty much everything. And frankly, that's consistent with what their strategy has been. There are 2019 on-prem products, Windows 2019, SQL Server 2019, but the excitement, at least from Microsoft, even for on-prem, were really those hybrid components. So Azure Stack Hub, Azure Stack Commercial, et cetera. All right, now, where are we with all this? This, of course, this webinar brought to you by INE. Now you have the very short little bit of sales pitch here before I turn it back over to Brittany, and she does what you came here for, which was to see who gets a fantastic INE swag box. All right, I do want to talk about kind of what we've got scoped out. I am the director of content for our Microsoft training, so all of this sort of falls under me. This is our current schedule. It may be subject to some change, but right now we do have learning paths for the Azure Architect exam. We also have coming out this quarter, before the end of the year, an Azure Administrator learning path that is associated with that certification. The rest of Azure may be a little bit later, looking at DevOps in Q3 of 2020 and Q4 of 2020 and Azure Developer of Q3. I'm hoping I might be able to bring those forward a little bit. On the Microsoft 365, we've got folks working on teamwork and messaging. Those should come out Q1 of 2020. Modern desktop, so your Windows 10 is really what that is. Looking at latest sometime in Q2 of 2020. And Enterprise Administrator probably coming out in Q3. And then our Windows Server, we do have someone working on Windows Server MCSE, but that's going to be a little bit longer. We have some MCSE related courses, and we're going to have more coming out for Windows Server. But in terms of having an entire learning path, we're probably not going to be able to get that all the way together until Q3 of 2020. All right, now, okay, Joshua. Great question. I don't see anything here for SCCM. Is there still no cert track specific to SCCM? All right, I'm going to give you the simple answer, which is no. And I will say that that is probably, from what I saw, and partially in the training community, because I'm trying to make sure I don't say anything that would be a violation of NDA. Let's just say don't expect that anytime soon. As much as you know, there's some thought about, you know, at some point doing certs for Windows and for SQL Server. I didn't really hear anything about any thoughts about having an SCCM certification. And that's probably about what I can say about that. I wish I had better information. What's the difference of Azure with the current version Windows 10? Azure and Windows 10, I'm not sure the exact question there, because Azure, of course, is a cloud-based, service-based system where you're going to spin up or create resources such as virtual machines and databases and storage, but not do it in your own data center. And there are Windows 10 VM images, virtual machine images in Azure, but the two are not really directly connected. What you'll see with Windows 10 from certainly a certification standpoint is that the certification is really tied into what's now Microsoft 365, which is really Office 365 plus Modern Desktop, where Modern Desktop is really Windows 10. So I'm sorry, I'm not sure that you know, if I imagine that probably doesn't answer your question directly. If you do have more questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. My contact information is at the beginning of this webinar, which will of course be recorded. Can you use Azure with Linux? Absolutely. And in fact, this is a story that's actually pretty cool, and that I have to give Microsoft some credit for, and really give a lot of credit to really the leadership over there and Satya Nadella and what they're doing. In that Microsoft, it has truly embraced Linux. There are things that come out in Azure for Linux before they come out for Windows. For example, I do a lot of things with web apps and containerized web apps. I could run containerized web apps on the Linux platform well before I could run containerized workloads or web apps on the Windows platform. Also, just little things like Cloud Shell, which is kind of the Azure version of Visual Studio Online, where I have an online command line interface into Azure that's directly provided by Azure. That was out actually, in fact, now it's only out on Linux. They tried doing Windows, but the Linux just worked better, which I think is pretty interesting. As far as tools to work with Azure, the tools that you have, the primary tools from Microsoft to work with Azure are cross-platform. They work on Windows, obviously. They also work on most Linux distros as well as Mac OS. So that includes Azure PowerShell. PowerShell now runs on Linux and Mac OS, as well as the Azure CLI. And if you're using some kind of UI shell, then a tool that I absolutely recommend, for example, is the Azure Storage Explorer, which also is cross-platform. Microsoft not only is cross-platform, but they do a lot of open source development, and a lot of their libraries are open source. All right, Alexander, why should I use Azure CDN? I hope Microsoft doesn't watch this. Because you have no other CDN alternatives. No. So the Azure CDN is interesting, and it is a content delivery network. It does what you would expect a content delivery network to do. However, I think relative to some other content delivery network options, you may find it to be a little bit, I don't want to say primitive, but maybe more difficult to do advanced things with, would be the way that I would put that. It has certainly improved over the last several years. There are more options that we have with it. Just in terms of management, I can go to a storage account right now and actually add CDN to the storage account, which creates a CDN resource and ties it into the storage account. So that is why I would use Azure CDN. I've already got an Azure subscription. I just want to throw CDN on there. I want to make it easy. But if you're doing anything sophisticated, that's definitely something that I would do some research on. All right. What is the MCSA, MCSE value after so much focus on Azure and cloud? That is a great question. And not that all the other questions weren't great. They were great, but this one is great too, because That's a complicated answer. So complicated, I needed to take a sip of water before I even try and get into this. And the answer is, not really sure. And the reason why I'm not really sure is because if you look at Microsoft and the direction they're headed, it's absolutely cloud-based. But the reality is there are still an awful lot of Microsoft customers who have either no cloud presence or they've got a data center presence that for a variety of very good reasons are not going away, and they want to be able to update their skill sets. Now, conceptually, what's going to happen eventually with the on-premises systems is that they will go towards a role-based certification. If that happens, and I would not at this point discourage you from getting the MCSA, MCSE, if you are working with on-premises capabilities, because what I found, and this certainly was true with the Azure environment, when they went to the role-based last year, and I don't generally like taking upgrade exams, but I kind of had to get these done really quickly. And at the time, there were 2 exams for Azure Architect, and there were 2 exams for Azure Admin, and I needed all of those. I did the upgrade exams. They were literally the easiest Microsoft exams I've taken in 24 years. That doesn't mean don't go in if you get the upgrade exam and it turns out to be hard. You can't come back and get your money back from me. But the point being that I think there is a reason to get the MCSE. It is still in the top 10 certifications for Microsoft. In fact, even as they're pushing cloud-based and role-based, they are not, you've got a, when you look at the top 10, and I can't go into details on that because of NDA, non-disclosure agreement, but just to say that these role-based certifications, while they're interesting, while they're getting all the love from Microsoft Learn, said it right, there's still a lot of demand for that on-premises MCSA, MCSE training, and obviously certification. All right. Any other questions? I do not see any. Oh, there we go. Where do I start learning Azure Cloud Technology? The best place to start learning Azure Cloud Technology would be with INE. You set me up, Gary. That was just too easy. We have a strategy here now. We don't have as much Microsoft content, as much Azure content as we will soon, but I've already got the Azure Architect, which is really the higher level. We kind of started with the expert level first, but we also have some introductory Azure content, as well as a learning path that's coming out in December, hopefully by the end of December, as I look at one of our production guys over here and hope he's not going to be mad at me for saying that. But that goes into Azure administration. And we will probably also, we've got some Azure fundamentals learning. So I would say the easiest answer for that is to take a look at INE, take a look at our subscription-based all access pass on-demand training. Cisco Voice and Network SME. How can you be an Azure SME? All right, anonymous. Well, by giving up any hope of being on-prem. No, that's not true. Here's the thing, I will tell you what I have found is that in many years of teaching Azure, that the people that tend to have the easiest path from a zero starting point are network engineers, right? Because a lot of the concepts that really are at the backbone of Azure are about networks, and particularly software-defined networking. Now, really, if you're a Cisco SME, then your networking requirements in Azure are going to be much lower. But really, what you want to do is think about Azure really as a data center, because that's what it is. It's just that you are several levels removed from the hardware, right? So you are doing things like provisioning virtual machines, but not worrying about the clusters, VMware Hyper-V clusters that they are being provisioned on. You are setting up virtual networks without worrying about the routers and switches that are underneath of that. And so really, again, kind of an add-on, again, what I would recommend is y'all are just giving me all these opportunities to do some selling. My marketing department's gonna be very happy with me. Got a thumbs up even. In any case, we definitely are, expanding rapidly our Azure training. And so it's something that I would suggest you look into that way. But it is also, like I said, for Cisco people, as long as you accept the fact that it's essentially a remote data center that's run by somebody else with a software layer on top of it, then I think you will have an easier time than many getting the concepts associated with Azure to get up to that subject matter expert level. Real quick, one more thing. If you're interested in learning about Azure Arc, I do plan on doing a webinar on Azure Arc, kind of looking at it, what it is, demonstrating it, and that should be in December. So keep an eye out for an announcement for that, and I'd love to have you come back and take a look at that. Thank you all very much. And Brittany, I believe we're good now. All right, so I'm gonna say goodbye. Have a great one, happy holidays, and if you have holidays coming up, and I hope to see you on a webinar soon.